So without further ado, let's move on to theme number 2. 222. 222. There we go. 22. All right. So, theme number 2. I was trying to decide what I wanted to share today, and I was brought back to the idea of something I shared. Was it last week or maybe the week before? I can't remember, week to week sometimes. And I was sharing how to do a scalloped border, right? And do you remember that cute little gnome quilt, Gnomes for All Seasons? So I was showing this the scallop template from Creative Grids, which I love, absolutely love. And if you remember me drawing the curves, and we talked about that you draw your curves first and then you get it quilted. So that happened this week while I was gone. It was like magic. I came back and Lorraine had quilted it. I was so excited. So I'll show it to you. And I thought, you know what? This would be the perfect time today for theme number 2 to talk about binding on a curve. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today, is binding on a curve. This is the quilt. Let's see. Gnomes for All Seasons is what it's called. So you can see, let's see, here's our St. Patrick's Day gnome, our Valentine gnome. So there's 12 blocks in here. Kind of cute, right? And the cool thing about this is it was a panel. So it was super easy to put together. So last week, or a week before, whenever I did this, I showed that I added the inner border and then the outer border, right? And it was just straight. And I said, if you use this template, you can get scalloped borders and have them be absolutely perfect going around and around. And it looks even throughout. And so it takes out all the math to be able to do it this way. And you just go ahead and you draw it on. So someone had asked me, why do you draw your lines on before the quilter quilts it? And this is a perfect example of why I would, because the amazing Lorraine, take a look at what she was able to do. Now, this is not bound yet. You can see it. I just went ahead and cut it just a few minutes ago, actually. But you can see, because I drew the line on, this gave Lorraine the opportunity to, she echoed the line coming a couple of inches out, was able to do the straight lines up and down, up and down, up and down. And then she did feathers following that line. So had this not been drawn on, had my scallops not been drawn on before, that would mean that she wouldn't really have something to follow. And that's where she was able to put those beautiful feathers in. Look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? As it comes around. So that's why we draw the lines on first. You don't use scissors to cut it yet. And then once it's quilted is when you now cut it. So then I was able to take scissors, or I could have taken my rotary cutter and cut it. And now it's time to bind the quilt. All right. You can kind of see, wow, look at the back of this. You can kind of get even a better look at all of the quilting she did. And all those gnomes. How fun is that? Okay. So what we're going to do, Alice asked, is that panel too big to use clear blue tiles? No, actually, I could have most certainly used clear blue tiles, but I wanted to have the quilting mimic the curves, and that's why I chose to have it quilted by a long armor. Okay, so out here you can see, look at that. That's just gorgeous. Okay, so let's talk about how do you bind these curves? Well, the nice thing is that the curves are very gentle with this template, very gentle. So you don't, it's sometimes when we think of scalloping, we think of like a scallop that goes like this round. It's almost like a half circle. This isn't the kind of scalloping I did on this. This is just like this gentle wave going all along, which is really kind of a fun look. But in order to do binding with a wavy border like that, then you do need to do something that's really important. And that is you've got to cut your binding on the bias. All right. You've got to cut your binding on the bias. Connie says it's just as pretty on the back as it is the front. I totally agree. All right. So uh, a bias is not scary to do. In fact, the one thing that I just love about bias is that it has that stretch, and that's why you have to do it on the bias, is because we're going around these curves. It's got to have a stretch rather than it being so tight. So today I'm going to show you, this is a fat quarter, and I've shared this before, but it's been a while, and so it might be a good review, or for people who haven't seen this before, my demonstration on the fact that you can get, now listen closely, you can get almost 5 yards of binding out of one fat quarter. Would you believe that? True story. Almost just under 5 yards out of one fat quarter. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, this quilt, I actually ended up having to do it by a half yard. All right, because the inches was more than the 5 yards would have been. So I ended up doing it by a half yard on this particular quilt. But if the same principle applies, whether you're doing it by a fat quarter, by a half yard, whatever it might be. And so I want to share with you how that's done. How do we fold the fabric? How do we put our strips together, especially when it comes to doing it on the bias? And then my tips for sewing it on, and then I pull it over to the back and I hand stitch it. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look. Let me pull this down, and I've got a fat quarter in front of me. Now, I chose this particular fat quarter on purpose for the demonstration, and it's because it has stripes going across. You see that? These little wavy stripes going across. The reason why I wanted to do it on striped fabric was to demonstrate on striped, is because if I were cutting it straight of grain, I would fold it like this, and I would just cut my strips like this, right? And then my strips would give that look. It would just go straight across. However, one of the fun things about doing it on the bias is that, especially with stripes, your stripes will go at a diagonal. Okay, so that's why I want to show it on this, so that you can see clearly it's not on the straight of grain, it is on the bias, which gives it a diagonal look. All right, so with my fat quarter, I have it laid out just like this. I have my long side here, my short side here. I'm going to take my left corner and bring it down to a point, and just about halfway. There's no need to go all the way down. I'm just going to go about halfway down. That's my left to the center. Now I'm going to take my bottom right to the center. So I'm going to bring this up like that, where they are now touching each other. Okay, so you can see it wouldn't matter if I was just up here and I brought this up a little bit more. It doesn't matter. I don't want you to get out a ruler and try to measure this. All you're doing is you're taking your top left, bring it down a little bit, your bottom right, bring it up a little bit. That's it. All right. So now we have 2 folds here. that are parallel to one another. I'm going to take this bottom fold and bring it up to the top to match the top fold up here. All right, so I'm just going to bring this here. And there we go. That's it. And now at this point, I'm going to turn it this way and I will cut it down the center. And then I'll start my strip cutting this way and then I'll turn it around and do it this way. I'll show you that in a minute. I know it'll make a lot more sense once I show you. And I'll tell you why I always start in the center. I always start in the center because that is where your longest strips are. Okay, center is where your longest strips are. So I always start in the center and I work my way out. Okay, now if you're in the club, I have a video on this as well. So you can go back and watch this. In fact, I think Jessica did the video on this one in the club. All right, so fat quarter, top left, bring it down to the center. Bottom right, bring it up to the center. I have 2 folds. I'm going to take my bottom fold and bring it up to the top. There we go. They're now kissing each other. And now one final thing, I'm just going to just move it so that it's easy for me to cut. All right, that's the only reason why I'm moving it. If I wanted to, I could bring this up again one more time and cut from there. It doesn't matter. But I'll go ahead and just kind of cut this approximately in the center into 2 pieces. I'm going to set this one aside. And now I'll bring this one over. And I kind of like my binding to be 2 1/4. So that's a personal preference. 2 1/4 works great. 2.5 inches is fine too. It's totally up to you. However big you want your binding is how wide your strips are going to be. So this is 2 1/4. I'll trim it. 2 1/4 and trim. And continue moving over from there. Okay, 2 1/4 and trim. Now, I could continue trimming. Well, I will on this one because I want you to see how small these little pieces are. They still will work, but they're very, very small. Let's take a look at this small one. See, it's this compared to, look at the first one that I did. This is why I start in the center, because I have my longest length is in the center. This still works, but I'm going to go ahead and start with my longest and move from there. Okay, so I now have that cut. I'm going to pull over my other piece. I'm actually going to rotate it around because I like to cut from left to right. Again, personal preference. So I just rotated it around and now I'm going to cut this way. Again, knowing that my longest lengths are in the center. 2 1/4, 2 1/4, and continue on down. Again, if you were doing a 1/2 yard of fabric, you would do the same technique. All right, you would bring the top left, you would open it up, top left, down to the center, bottom right, down to the center. Okay. And I could even get one more little piece right there. All right. So let me see if there's any questions so far on that, and then I'll show you how to join these. All right. Yep, it's a fat quarter. Could you use the Stripology hair ruler here? Absolutely. Thank you, Sherry. She said, yep, it is in the club is the video by Jessica. It's in the QC vault. Oh, Lorinda's never seen this method. Yay. Cordy, don't worry about lining up the stripes. It will drive you bonkers. So don't worry about that. It's okay. Okay. All right. If you have a striped border, is this how you should do it? It depends, Lisa. If you want the stripes to be on the diagonal, then yes, that's how you want to do it. If it doesn't matter to you, if you want them straight across, then you would just do straight of grain. Okay, let's take a look at this. Do you see what I mean? This is where now my stripes go diagonal. And can you see how kind of bouncy that is? There you go. It's so bouncy. That means it has a lot of give to it. If I were just doing something straight of grain, you wouldn't have this bounce in it. All right. In fact, I should have probably cut a piece of straight of grain to show you, but I don't have any other fabric here. But you can see there's a definite bounce. Now I'm going to fold this in half so you can see this is, you know, if we were creating binding, I'd be putting my wrong sides together and you would have this binding be on the diagonal, which is really a lot of fun. This is really cute. Like if you're doing a Christmas quilt and you want red striped binding, right? Like a candy cane, that would be really fun. So it really is it's just so fun to do on the bias. And I hope what I showed you is that it's not that scary. It's not that scary to do. So give it a try. All right, now how do you piece these together? Let's bring the camera back down. Now this part may seem a little frustrating to some people because it is like putting together a puzzle. But that's how I want you to think of it, guys, is as a puzzle, because not all of the pieces are going to be working perfectly. Let me show you what I mean. Okay. So if I'm trying to add on a whole thing of binding, I'm going to look through my pieces, and here I have a second piece, and oh, look at that. Those go in the same direction. So I'm good. I can sew these two together. Now, the other important thing to note is, let me see if I can find one that's not the same. Okay, this one, for example, look at this. Do you see it's not going in the same direction? So if I were trying to sew this together, this is what would happen. I would think to myself, oh, this works. Look, this fits right on top of the other one. Well, actually it doesn't, because let me grab a pin. Let's take a look here. I'm going to audition this. If I were sewing this strip one on top of the other, see, this is a little bit different than what we're used to when we do like straight across the seams. Okay, I put a pin in there to pretend that I just sewed it. So let's say I sewed this and I pinned it. Uh-oh, look what happens. That's not what I want. We're not doing mitered borders, right? We just need a binding strip here. And so this is what happens when we place this one directly on top of the other. I hope that makes sense. So there you go. Don't do that. Instead, find a piece that looks like if you were to put these two together, it looks like it's going to go straight, and it is going to go straight. But there's one thing you've got to remember, and that is when we place it one on top of the other, take a look at what happens. It's actually this way. Pull this up a little bit. It actually looks a little strange because we're not used to sewing our strips this way. But if we take our little pin, you can see, I'm going to audition this here. I'm going to pretend that I had just sewn a 1/4 inch seam. When I do it this way, look what happens. I pull it out, and there you go. Okay, now you have it continuing on. Oh, look at that. I was able to match those stripes up pretty good. I don't usually try. It's just, that just happened to work really well, which is pretty nice. Hey, look at that. Cool, 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 cool. So Again, when you're trying to find the pieces, you're going to pull one out and you're going to go, oh, here we go. And then you go, uh-oh, that's not going to work. And so then you flip it around and you go, oh, that works. It was the same piece. So remember, think of it as a puzzle. Think of it as a puzzle. This does not fit. I turn this around and voila, it fits. So I'm going to take this, place it right side down on top of the other strip. And it looks kind of weird at first, but if I were to sew this, look what happens. It now becomes a straight piece. Again, all one piece. Now, another tip is that when you're doing this, you will want to actually, rather than having tip to tip, let me show you what happens when we do tip to tip sewing on an angle. Can you, I don't know how well you can see that, but it actually goes down. Let's take a look. And these are no longer lined up. Let's see. This one is shorter. This one is longer than my top one. So sewing tip to tip doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to offset it just a little bit. So I'm actually going to bring this up about 1/4 of an inch above. Let me show that. There's 1/4 inch above at an angle. I'm going to place my pin in here so I can see if this works. Now I sew it. Now when I open it, ta-da, it's perfect. It's perfect on both sides. Both the top and the bottom line up. So that's another tip for you when you're piecing these things together, is you do need to offset it just about 1/4 of an inch. And then it will turn out perfect every time. All right. Okay, now we're going to talk about sewing it on. But before we do, let me see if we have any questions. Oh, thank you, Ginger. I appreciate that. Let's see. You're like a genius. No, that's Kyle. I wish I could say that. Dee said this is where she's gotten confused in the past. Is it with the angles? Is that where the problem is? If that's where the problem is, Dee, you can tell me if I'm on the right track with what your question is. If that is what the problem is, then just keep auditioning. All right. Keep auditioning. Keep trying to fit that puzzle. And you might get to the point at the very end, you're on the very last piece. Okay. And it's not lining up. You're like, what do I do? What do I do? It's not, the puzzle's not working. Guess what? You are the boss of your strips. Guess what you can do? If it's going this way and it needs to go the opposite way, there's nothing wrong with going zoop and making it go the way you need it to go. Okay. Dee says, yes, the angle, sewing them together. I hope that information helps. You just got to do it the other way. Okay. And you can do that. You can cut it. I give you permission to do that. All right. Let's see. Lisa said, cutting it is scary and then trying to piece it together is where I get so difficult for me. Yeah, understandable. I hope the demo I hope I was able to explain that well enough that you're just taking the top left, bring it down, bottom right, bringing it down, bringing those two together to kiss, and then you just cut your strips. Sometimes we make it so much harder than it needs to be. We psych ourselves out to say like, oh, bias, that's so scary. It doesn't have to be scary. And again, the real key here is lining these up, those don't go in the right direction. So don't try to make them in the right direction, and go find another piece. Let's see, that's not in the right direction. Go find another piece that is in the right direction. There we go. Okay, that's the right direction. So go ahead and find it, and then after, like, you get to the very end and there's not a piece that's going in the right direction, don't be afraid to cut it yourself in the right direction, and you'll be good to go. All right. Okay. So again, what I demonstrated on was 1 fat quarter, and you can get almost 5 yards of binding. So let me do some math here real quick. If we do 5 yards, that's 5 times 36. That's 180 inches of binding. So as you're trying to figure out your binding, but it's a little bit less than 5 yards. So I'd say like 170 inches of binding you're going to get out of 1 fat quarter. So if your project only needs 170 inches and below a binding, pull out a fat quarter and do it from that, and it'll be really slick. This binding, it actually needed about 200 inches of binding. So that's why I went up to the half yard. So, all right. So let's talk about adding this binding now. So what I started doing, let me see where I began. Okay. I always, whenever I'm doing my binding, I'm going to leave like an 8 to 10 inch tail at the beginning. Now, I know a lot of us love to sew binding on by machine, and you certainly can both ways. I just have a preference towards sewing it on the front first and then hand binding it on the back. And especially when it comes to curves, because I just feel like I have a little bit more control in being able to just pull that down when I want to. Again, that's my personal preference. So for me, I would sew it on the front first, a 1/4 inch, and then I can bring it over to the back. Now look how cute this is going to be once it's all finished being bound. Isn't that fun? I chose a plaid fabric that's going to go around and around. So I started stitching that on. And again, like I said, I use 2 1/4. It's just personal preference, but I love the 2 1/4. I like it wrapping around a little bit more. So that's what I do. Now, but 2 1/2 is great too. Now, when you go around curves, it's important to just take it slow. And I'm going to show you, I'm not going to put it on the machine because I'm afraid you're not going to be able to see it very well. But let me pull this down. Whoops. Okay. And okay, I'm stitching along, singing a song, right? And I'm going around, and I'm going down into a hill. Be careful when you go down into those, not a hill, a valley, excuse me. I'm at the top of the hill. I'm going down into a valley. Be careful just to take it slow. And sometimes you want to give just a little added, I don't want to say excess, but what I will say, maybe this is a better way to say it, is I don't want you to pull it too tight as you are going around the curve. Okay, sometimes we get really excited and we're pulling on that fabric as it's going through the machine. I don't want you to pull on it because we need to give it a little bit of give as it goes down into the valley. Okay, so you're stitching along, singing a song, and you go down and you allow it to have a very gentle curve. You're not pulling on your fabric. You're not pulling on the binding. You're not pulling on your quilt. You're just letting it naturally flow in. So you're going to do that all the way around the entire quilt. Then once you're finished, you'll bring this up and around. How cute that is. I'm dying. I cannot wait to finish this. And all you have to do is hand stitch the back. To hand stitch it, I'd be using a blue thread, and I would be using like an invisible stitch, and I would just stitch it along. And I love being able to do this by hand. It's something that I find very rewarding. Excuse me, can't say that word. Very rewarding. And what it does is it allows me to slow down and in life, really, to slow down and to just take my time and enjoy the process of hand stitching. So that is my personal preference. Now, it also will depend on what kind of quilt I'm doing. If it's a quilt that's going to be washed a lot, like a camping quilt, a picnic quilt, maybe a child's quilt that's going to be drug around, then I most certainly will do it by machine, both sides. But I really do enjoy the look of sewing it on the front, having a beautiful front here, and then just hand stitching on the back. Okay. So that is theme number 2. I hope that helped. Oh, yeah, I totally agree, Peggy. She said that she loves hand stitching the back too. It's her favorite part. Yeah, I kind of get giddy. I know that might sound weird to some of you, but I get kind of giddy when I think, ooh, I get to sit down and just hand stitch my quilt. I just love it. Love, love, love it. Turn on a good movie, and perfect. All right, Carol has a great question. Where is the best spot to put your ends together, the hill, the valley, or in between? I have found that I like putting them it's kind of in between. It's not at the top of the hill and it's not at the bottom of the valley. It's almost like it's on its way down, but not all the way down. So I hope that helps. All right. Yeah, I think so. Kathy, she says it's your therapy. I do. I love it. It just it forces me to sit still for a minute, which I love. Okay, Kathy is asking this question. For durability, and you sew both front and back, which side do you sew first, to the front or to the back? That's a great question, Kathy. You could do either way, but the way that most people prefer, because they know that they're going to catch both, is to sew it on the back first and bring it over to the front. And then you sew just a titch inside that fold and you're golden. Okay, so usually that's the way to do it. Sew it on the back first, bring it around to the front, and do it that way. There are some who are really good. I have not figured out how to master this yet. Maybe one day I will. But where you would sew on the front first, bring it over to the back, clip it with your Wonder Clips or whatever it might be, and then you would actually stitch in the ditch from the front, and if you're really good, it will catch the back. Now, it can be a little tricky, but it can be done. And one of the things I would recommend, if you're going to try it that way, is I would put little dots of glue in my binding on the back, like a Roxanne's glue, or Jill Lilly has a glue. I would put little dots of glue along the way. I would bring it to the back. I would press it with an iron to heat it, which is going to make it dry fast. And then that way I know that my binding isn't going to shift on me. And then I would go and stitch down the ditch from the front. And if my back went just a titch beyond that first stitch line that you had sewed it on, you should be able to catch the back. Maybe we should try that sometime all together. But that is one way you could do it. Okay. Let's see. Susan's never had good luck with doing that. Yeah, same, Susan. It seems like I always miss something on the back, but that is it could be done. It could. You just got to get really good at it. All right. Yay. Brenda said, oh, I just learned this process and it's magical. She loves it. Nice, 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 nice. Okay. Good idea. Debbie said she usually sews on the back and then sews on the front last, and she usually uses a decorative stitch. So you definitely could do that. In fact, another really fun way of doing that is sewing it on the back first, bringing it over to the front, and even whether it's a decorative stitch or maybe you do a blanket stitch, opposite direction. So if you have a mirror image on your machine, you can make it go towards the right rather than towards the left is what it usually does, the blanket stitch. Make it go towards the right and you have a nice little blanket stitch over top of your binding. That's a really cute look too. So, yeah. Okay, Lisa asked, can you show us with a regular cut of fabric, not a fat quarter? I had the binding from Candy Corn Quilt and it's a stripe. Yes, I could. Let me think. What's the yardage on it? I don't even know what the yardage is on for that. You know what? Let me show you something. I think I can do it this way. If you're going to treat it just like you would with a fat quarter. Let me see if I can. There's got to be some yardage in here, I bet. Yeah. Ooh. All right. So here's some yardage. Okay. If I want to do the same thing, all I have to do is open it all the way up. All right. And when I open it all the way up, I can have one side go down, one side go up, fold it over again if I want to. And it's the same thing. So let me pull this down. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the whole thing in the camera, but I'll do my best. Okay, so this is the whole piece of regular fabric. I'm going to do the same exact thing. I bring the top left up. I bring the bottom right up. Now, don't be worried that they don't touch in the middle. I could have them touch, but I don't have to have them touch. It's really all about the direction you are going. So let's say I have a little bit of space here. That's okay. I still have my fold on this side, my fold on this side. I bring them up to meet. I could bring it up again to meet. And then now I have one big long strip. I'm going to turn it this way, and then I'm going to cut from there. Does that make sense? So don't let it, just because it's a fat quarter that I demoed it with, it's the same exact way. It's just bigger. You just have more fabric to work with. Again, top left, down, bottom right, up. You have two folds going down this way. Now bring them up to the top. I'm going to bring it up one more time to the top. Move it, shift it this way so I can cut, go out, cut, and go out. And that's all there is to it. All righty. I hope that helped. Brenda. Attitude, my friend. I'm just teasing. She says, honestly, I would rather throw out the quilt than hand stitch the binding. I get it. It's all how you look at it, for sure. It's definitely not for everyone. Oh, there you go. Okay. Oh, that's right. Julie said this. Okay. Whoever had asked about the candy corn, you don't want to cut that one on the bias because, oh, that's not what I was pointing out. Julie, Said the candy corn quilt had a stripe binding. It was printed on an angle, however. So if you want an angled border, you have to cut it on the straight. Good point. Okay, so now now that you say that, I remember what the binding looked like. All right. The binding in Candy Corn Quilt Shop is that black and white stripe. Am I right? If I remember correctly, I believe it's black and white stripe. The black and white stripe is already, the print is going on a bias diagonal. So if you want the bias diagonal, you only want to cut it straight of grain. You don't want to worry about doing it on the bias, because what will happen is that the bias is now going to turn it opposite, and now you'll have straight black and white striped going. Does that make sense? So yeah, you want to make sure if it's already on the stripe and you want it to keep it on the stripe, on the diagonal, I should say, then don't do it on the bias. But if you want it to have a diagonal and it's going straight, that's when you do it on the bias. Great questions. All righty. So, oh, you all are so welcome. You are all so welcome. I love being able to share. Uh-oh, you're confused, Lisa? I wish I had some fabric to show you. Well, let me pull out this one out real quick. Okay. By the way, the number 3 are these beautiful stripes. So let me take this pink stripe, for example. Okay. This pink stripe is already, is going straight across. Notice it's not on a diagonal. Okay. It's going straight across. But if I want it to go on the diagonal, then I will cut it on the bias. Okay. If I don't want it to go on the diagonal and I want it to go straight, I'm going to just cut it as it is. I'm just going to cut strips, straight strips. Okay, just straight strips. If you have a print that is already going diagonal, such as Candy Corn Quilt Shop, I wish I had a sample to show you. But if I had Candy Corn Quilt Shop and that print was already on the diagonal, then you still want to cut it. You don't want to cut it on the bias, because the bias is going to make it like this. So I hope that helps. Lisa's worried about matching it up when she cuts it straight. No, don't worry. Life's too short to worry about those kinds of things. Honestly, I don't worry about stripes matching up. I mean, you could, but why? It's okay. It's a-okay.